and make it a race. And as you would know, the first time anyone really made a conscientious effort to get to the South Pole was in 1912. And Robert Falcon Scott had made this his goal. He's going to reach the South Pole. He's going to, big expedition, let's go, let's reach the South Pole. And at the last moment, Roald Amundsen pulled in and said, nope, you're not going alone, it's a race. And so there were these striking parallels from more than 100 years ago all the way to now, from the very start. And the more I researched, the more I got into it, the more I realized that not only were there parallels just in this situation, the men themselves were parallel. They found themselves in almost some of the exact same situations. And it just brought history forward so much. And then on top of it, of course, the idea that there's still exploration going on today in 2018 was just amazing. So at the heart of it, this book is really about four men, 2 in 1912, 2 in 2018. Robert Falcon Scott, as I said, was really the first one in 1912. He had made it his goal to reach the South Pole. The trip, the race that is described in this book was actually his second time to Antarctica. And it's easier to describe for the second time why he's there. It's this redemption attempt. He had not gotten to the South Pole his first time around. To be honest, I mean, it's hard to say sitting here in Ohio because I'm very far from Antarctica, but he really wasn't even close to the South Pole his first time. So the second time, it's a redemption attempt. But the first time, why he was there in the first place, we don't know. Historians still, to this day, have no good grasp on why he went in the first place. In his own words, he describes Antarctica as an awful land. He says he has no predilection for polar exploration whatsoever. So why he's there, we don't know. We have some guesses, but it was very interesting in writing this book to try and understand him and try and understand his reasons for going and understand what implication those reasons had on the effectiveness of his trip. His contemporary, Roald Amundsen, to use a cliche that's appropriate here, was an open book. I mean, if you've ever known small children, they tend to fixate on one thing, like construction vehicles or rescue equipment or scuba diving.
Yes, I'm trying to figure it out.
Generally, they grow out of this. But Roald Amundsen was fixated on polar exploration, on getting to really the North Pole since he was a child, and he never grew out of it. He was bound and determined to go to the North Pole, but when someone beat him there, he simply turned around and honestly headed south. It was that smooth of a motion. I don't think he even thought twice about it. Someone beat me north, fine, I'm headed south. And again, this is where the parallels are, because Lewis Rudd in 2018 was the first one to say, all right, I'm going to, in 2018, try and traverse Antarctica solo, unsupported, unaided. And he had been bound and determined since he was a child to get there. I think he was 10, so maybe a little older than Roald when he made this his goal, but his whole life, he joins the military. And even then he focuses on Arctic warfare so that at the first chance, he can go to Antarctica. He is going to be prepared whenever this chance comes about, and he's convinced it will. And again, his contemporary, Colin O'Brady, can only describe in the vaguest, fuzziest notions why on earth he's in Antarctica. So there are again and again and again, and it just astounded me that the more I researched, the more I found these parallels. So not to say that the book wrote itself, but it certainly was intriguing all the way through. So with that, Molly has asked that I read a little bit from the book, and in thinking about where to start and what sections to read, I realized that while this is a book about four men, really, there's another group that's missing from that characteristic, from those characters, and that's really animals. So in the late 1990s, animals were banned from Antarctica. We can't possibly have dogs or ponies there anymore. They're trying to keep it very environmentally pristine. But for both Scott and Amundsen in 1912, animals are going to factor in to their strategy huge. I mean, they're going to be a huge, huge factor in the strategy of getting to the South Pole. And of course, Scott and Amundsen, being who they are, have drastically opposite views on animals and on dogs specifically. So I thought I would start by reading from very close to the beginning of the book. Scott is reflecting on his first failed trip to the South Pole, where the first trip he took to Antarctica, where he didn't make it to the South Pole. And it shows his attitude towards dogs. Scott had missed his mark. To the nation, he was English, so he's English. To the nation, he might be a hero, but in his own eyes, he had failed. He hadn't gone far enough. It had been the dogs. He had taken dogs, had intended for them to pull sleds across the ice and up glaciers. Dogs were supposed to be hardy. They were supposed to eat half of what a man did, but pull almost as much. They were supposed to respond to orders and mind their human masters. They were supposed to, but it hadn't worked out that way. It is odds that the dog, rather than the man, directs the walk, Scott had lamented. The dogs had turned on him and turned on one another. In the end, the men had ended up hauling the dogs. So this colors his view of dogs and really the labor that they can bring, the benefit that they can bring to helping him reach the South Pole. So his second time around, he does bring dogs. He also brings mechanical sleds. He calls them polar motor cars and sledges, motor sledges. And he also brings ponies. So when he gets to Antarctica for the second time, he has to weigh, what is he going to throw his money behind, his ponies or his dogs? And of course, when you get to Antarctica, working with the animals there is going to be different than planning. So part of Scott's strategy, and Edmondson's too, is to lay a series of depots or resupply drops along the way to help them on the race the next season. So this section is Scott in Antarctica for the second time, looking at one of the depot laying trips, taking both ponies and dogs and trying to weigh the benefits of each. From the start, the ponies had a rough time. On the barrier, the snow was deep and soft. The dogs raced ahead just fine, but the heavy ponies sank down over and over. As soon as they were safely away from the edge of the ice, Scott decided to stop and make the first drop, calling this safety camp. Slowly urging the ponies on, they traveled east around fields of crevasses before heading due south. They made another drop at this turn, which they named Corner Camp. The drop had come just in time too, because no sooner had they set out their supplies than a blizzard began to rage. The ponies were nothing short of miserable. They had shed their winter coats when the Terra Nova, the ship, had sailed through the tropics, and their thin summer coats couldn't stand the cold. The blizzard lasted for 4 days, and 3 of the ponies became so sick that they couldn't go on. As soon as the weather let up, one of the men took the 3 animals and turned back towards Cape Evans. Every effort had to be made to save the ponies. They were too important for the journey to the pole next year. The dogs, the vicious feral dogs, were hungry and bored. The blank white horizon was flat and changeless. Without anything to pull towards, they felt little reward for their days of hard work. They were being fed a lot, more than they would have back at Cape Evans, but it was nothing compared to the debt made by pulling hundreds of pounds all day, every day. They did their work when blows and cursing made them, but it came at the price of savagery. So that's Scott, and he really cannot see the benefit in dogs, even acknowledging that the dogs were having a fine time, that they were not struggling like the ponies did. He really just sees them as these vicious, feral animals. And of course, that's going to contrast to Edmondson and how he feels about dogs. So this section that I'd like to read about Edmondson is him just after having decided to change his goal from the North Pole to the South Pole. The first thing he did after deciding on his new goal was to order 100 Greenland dogs. Dogs, he was convinced, were the only practical draught animals for use on the snow and ice. They are quick, strong, sure-footed, intelligent, and able to negotiate any terrain that man can traverse. They weathered the blinding sun and the cold well, and if they had to, they would eat other dogs as food. There was a certain magic about them, a personality and dynamic that made handling the dogs as much of an art as leading people. The dog must understand that he has to obey in everything, Amundsen later wrote, and the master must know how to make himself respected. He didn't understand Captain Scott and the reluctant English attitude towards dogs. It was their loss. And again, it's going to be different in Antarctica once he gets there. I mean, and Amundsen had never made a trip to Antarctica to explore on land the way Scott had. So when Amundsen does get to Antarctica, he makes these trips between where his ship, the Fram, is anchored and base camp, which he calls Framheim, which translates literally to home of the Fram. Scott also at one point will go on to name one of his base camps Hut Point, because this is literally the point of land where he builds a hut. So creative naming conventions were not their forte by any means. But in this section, we see Amundsen experiencing his dogs in Antarctica for the first time, making these trips between Fram, the ship, and Framheim, the base camp. With a campsite chosen and firm anchor set, it was the dogs' turn to work. Amundsen hitched 8 dogs, some of his strongest and finest, to a sled loaded with 600 pounds of equipment to take to Framheim. He cracked his whip. He yelled. The sledge moved forward, and then it stopped. The dogs simply sat down and looked at one another in confusion. What could it mean that they were expected to heave against this weight? The dogs had spent half a year on the Fram in lying about eating and drinking, Amundsen wrote, and had got the impression that they would never have anything else to do. The dogs had forgotten that they were there for a reason. By inches and yards, Amundsen and his men moved them forward, yelling, whipping, beating them as needed to make the dogs understand. It was harsh treatment and slow going, to say the least. In his head, Amundsen did a quick calculation and, at this pace, figured it would take his team almost a year to go from Framheim to the pole. The dogs had to be made to go faster, to work harder. The whips came out over and over until the dogs were in shape once again. Amundsen and his men worked the dogs hard, pushing them to be the conquering force the men knew them to be. Yet the men were anything but unfeeling. They knew each dog by its voice, and they knew just by listening if the dogs were hungry or love-struck or tired or playful. And when one dog was frostbitten after getting his leg wrapped in a harness, Amundsen himself spent 30 minutes soothing the paw, making sure he was all right. The dogs were as much a part of the team as any man. So that was very, very different, of course, with Scott treating them as feral animals and Amundsen accepting them as part of the team. As I mentioned, in 2018, it was alone, solo. So of course the men were alone, and of course animals are not allowed in Antarctica in the 21st century. But equipment for both Lou and Colin is going to be as important as the animals. And just like Scott and Amundsen, using the equipment in Antarctica for the first time versus practicing and training at home is going to be very different. So I have just 2 more sections to read. Lou read his first experience pulling his pulk, which is what they call a sled, a polar exploration sled. His first experience on his journey in Antarctica, and then Colin's same time, almost the exact same equipment and what he's thinking and feeling. So to begin with Lou Rudd, it was time to get moving. The pulk sitting on the ice in front of him was the biggest he had ever pulled. The carbon Kevlar sled was 7.5 feet long. Empty, it weighed 16.5 pounds. Full, on that first day, it weighed 364. It was ridiculously heavy, and the unfortunate conditions on the ground made it feel heavier still. Each step forward, Lou would have to pull against the resistance of snow as well as the weight of the pulk. On top of that, the entire way to the South Pole was uphill. Lou gritted his teeth and laid into his harness. Really tough going, Lou posted in his first blog entry. He refused to even think about the possibility of giving up. Everything he would miss about home, all the little luxuries like daily showers, fresh food, clean underwear, and indoor plumbing, he boxed it all up in his mind and put it at the finish line. His plan was simple. The only way you're ever going to get any of that back, he told himself, your old life, everything you know and love, is by skiing. The only way back to those things he had craved was to finish. But Lou had a lifetime of resilience to rely on. He had lived through worse. In Antarctica, he got to sleep in a tent all night. On military duty in Norway, he had to wake up at 3 a.m. to lay outside the tent on sentry duty, he remembered. And no matter how hard it got, in Antarctica, at least no one was shooting at him. Compared to that, this expedition was just cold weather camping. He had made it through plenty of hard times before. And then in nearly the same place at exactly the same time, Colin is pulling his pulk and starting out in this deep snow in Antarctica for the first time. And this is his perspective as he's getting going. Things began to go wrong for Colin as soon as he landed at the start. As the plane receded into the distance, Colin started loading his bags into the pulk. He had checked one by one to make sure when the plane dropped him off that he had everything with him. Now he loaded it all into the pulk once more, securing the entire load and tightening straps across its belly. Then, with a slight thwack, a strap broke. It was just a strap. The remaining 3 would hold the load. His journey would go on. But his gear was breaking and he hadn't taken a single step forward. When he finally did move, it was agony. He called his wife in tears, using precious, expensive minutes on his satellite phone. Maybe we didn't get it right, he cried to her. His pulk was 40 pounds heavier than Lou's. The veteran had taken off into the distance. To Colin, it looked like Lou was skiing on effortlessly. With all of his might, Colin could barely make the pulk bulge. Jenna, his wife, was calm. Small steps would add up. Just get to the first marker, she urged, telling him to haul just 2 miles on his first day. Set up your tent. You'll feel better. He made it to the marker that night, but it had used everything he had, mentally and physically, to get there. His distance for the first day was 2 miles. The end was more than 900 miles away. So again, that's very different perspectives, very different personalities, very different men facing the same conditions with largely the same equipment and same starting. One of the other things Molly asked is that the pictures in the book are incredible. I was very, very fortunate to come across some amazing pictures, and she suggested that I share some and go into some detail of them with you that, again, I couldn't get into it in the book. So if you'll give me a second to start sharing my screen.
That would be great.
Let's see here. All right, Molly, can you see that?
Looks great. Yep, perfect.
Okay,
Perfect.
Perfect. So one of the things I forgot to mention about Scott and Amundsen is that along with being very different, they were very different in terms of how they marketed their journeys. Amundsen was a natural born storyteller. He was honestly just a joy to write about and to write with because his quotes were so ready-made. There's one part, I think, to get included in the book, that he's trying to rally his men around one of the depot-laying trips, and he eventually decides to not make a speech simply because he hasn't had his coffee in the morning. And he's like, he just gives up and walks away because he hasn't had his coffee, so why bother? Scott, on the other hand, is not quite as gifted with words or stories like that, but he did have the foresight to bring in a professional photographer. So this is Herbert Ponting, and Herbert Ponting's entire mission there was to document the trip, to document the men, and to document Antarctica. So it's one thing to hear Scott write, honestly, quite depressingly, about these doldrums that just trapped the ship before, and it's called pack ice, before they could actually reach Antarctica. But it's another to have Ponting step out of the ship, walk across the ice, and take a picture of it literally trapped by these feet and feet of ice, this thick ice. In Antarctica, again, Ponting's one of his main jobs was to just describe through pictures how vast this landscape was. So it's something most of us really can't grasp. Again, sitting here in the Midwest, sitting here in Ohio, there's nothing I've ever seen that looks quite like that. And if I can use my cursor, you know, they're down in the shadows, there are 2 men. And Ponting really was quite a good photographer in that he then walked into the grotto, turned around and took the same picture from the opposite direction, where you can see that those icicles are tall as or taller than the men, that you can see just how deep this is, and just the framing of the ship that looks tiny in the background. And you start to get a sense very visually for what Antarctica, the expanse of it, how treacherous the landscape really is. One of the other things Ponting did was to take pictures of the men and daily life around camp. This helped me a ton as a writer because, of course, this happened in 1912, and these men, these characters, I call them characters in my head, were adults at the time. They have long since passed away. But I mean, come on, I've seen dorm rooms that look like that. You know, they're not wholly unfamiliar to us. They're not just characters in history books. And seeing these pictures really made that come alive for me. He also had most of the men sit for professional portraits. So Scott's entire expedition at one point or another got very well done portraits taken. And again, this is where it hits you that, or hit me certainly, that these are not, characters from long ago. These could be any number of our friends, and they certainly have lives and emotions and histories like we would expect. The same was true, of course, for Scott. And Ponting devoted a lot of his pictures to Scott, as you would expect of an expedition manager. You see Scott in his expedition gear. You see Scott tending to the work of any expedition leader, doing books inside what they call a hut, but is actually a quite well-established building. And then the central picture is one that did get included in the book, and ones that really just haunts me, because as I said, we don't know why Scott went to Antarctica. And, we do have his writing where he talks very depressingly about it quite a lot. And Ponting snapped this picture of him on a return from a very unsuccessful, very troubling depot laying mission. And some of the emotion that Scott never really gets into his own writing, I think comes through very clearly in this picture. So again, that helped me quite a lot. In 2018, I need to say a very, very grateful thank you to Antarctica Logistics and Expedition, who not only had made their staff available for hours of interviews, which were just incredible, and a wealth of information, very, very graciously helped me through that. But they also made their database of very high resolution, incredible, just stunning pictures available to me. So this is a picture from 2000, well, it's a picture in the 2018, it's certainly the 21st century. But these are the mountains that both Scott and Edmondson would have faced. And it's snow and it's ice, but troubling for Scott, Edmondson, Rudd and O'Brady is not the ice, it's the rock. It's the how do you pull a sledge, a very, very heavy sledge, over the rock. And so that's something that all four men really have to deal with, either in route planning or in the moment. Travel in Antarctica is, of course, very different in the 21st century than it was, in 2012, or in, I'm sorry, 1912. So this is a ski-equipped twin otter, which again, perhaps it's just me. I'm sure this is every day to some people in the world, but a plane with skis. That's fun, that's different. So there are actually no concrete runways in Antarctica. So for travel within the continent, if you're not, doing a solo, unsupported, unaided expedition, if you're doing it the more luxurious way, you'll take one of these planes from base camp, from Union Glacier base camp to the different research outposts or to the South Pole. To get to the South Pole, though, you fly in this enormous 4-engine jet from Argentina to Union Glacier Base Camp. And again, over and over, I was struck by just the expanse of Antarctica, because I'm sure we've all seen planes that are, that large. But to put it against the backdrop of the mountains and just realize what you're seeing again is an incredible picture. And like I mentioned before, there's no concrete runways in Antarctica. And one of the interviews that I was able to do with the ALE expedition manager, Steve Jones, he's British. And I certainly hope that I only laughed internally during this interview and didn't actually chuckle when he said this, because I was concerned. I was like, it's ice. Won't the planes slip? Aren't they going to slide all over the place? This, clearly you guys do it, but it doesn't seem very safe to me. And he said, no, these blue ice runways, it's so cold in Antarctica. And he used the word slippy, which is very fun. And I don't think it made it into the book, but he said it's so cold that the blue ice is no longer slippy. So the planes can land safely on these naturally occurring runways. So this ginormous plane, it was originally designed for exploring Siberia, for navigating through Siberia, is what most people use to travel from Argentina to the Union Glacier Base Camp. And this is base camp. This is what base camp looks like in 2018. So these are all clamshelled tents, double-walled clamshelled tents. And again, you can see a little picture of a guy right there. So like everything in Antarctica, it's enormous. These tents are enormous. These are two-person tents. They fit a twin bed the width of the way. And at the end of the season, everything is packed up and taken off the continent. The few buildings that you see there are pushed into the lee of the mountain, or else they'd be covered with snow. But everything else, that's why you don't really see any, 5-star hotels in Antarctica, because everything's collapsible. They're going to take it entirely off the continent at the end of the season. Otherwise, this is Antarctica. This is why Scott was complaining that his dogs had nothing to pull towards, because unless you're faced with a mountain, which isn't a lot of the continent, it's blank ice and sky, if you're lucky, blizzards if you're unlucky, which Colin and I think at one point Lou also described like being in the inside of a ping pong ball. So this is what Antarctica looks like if you're lucky. And this is how the men in 2018, this is how they navigated. This is not a picture from either Colin or Lou's journey. You can see the extra people there. So this is certainly not a solo trip. But this is a chest compass that they would strap to the harness on their chest. And this is what the men would stare at for their entire day. They would simply look down at this compass, at the ice, and move forward every single day for, 11, 13 hours for months on end. So if you're lucky, you've got an Antarctica that looks like this, but more often it's mountains or simply ice and simply snow. So those are some of the very dramatic, very, I think, gripping pictures that really helped to make this story come alive for me.
Those are fantastic. Thank you for showing them. I have so many questions, but before I get to mine, I'm going to open it up to our audience. And if anyone wants to ask a question, please just indicate, either raise your hand or contact me through chat or use your little hand icon. Heather Weiss, go ahead. You can take yourself off mute if you'd like and ask a question.
Isabel, my daughter here, actually has a question. Go ahead.
How long did it take you to write the book?
That's a very good question. So writing itself, let's see here. So I sat alone and tapped away at my computer, doing the research, doing the writing, doing a whole bunch of edits with myself and my wonderful critique partners, Tracy and Andrew, that were around here. So that took me about 10 months. Then I handed it off to Brian Geffen, my wonderful editor, and he and I went back and forth a few times to make some comments and made some changes. And then, so at the end of about a year, so let's see here, I think the editing took about 2 to 4 months, somewhere in there. So that whole process from the time I started writing to the end of the editing process took somewhere around a year. And then it took almost an entire year, maybe 9 months to a year, for it to go from just a Word document to the actual book. And that's where, the wonderful team of art designers were laying out the pictures and creating the cover. We were going through and checking for all of those commas that I hope are correct, making sure everything's spelled correctly. So I got a lot of help with that part. So about 2 years start to finish, just under 2 years start to finish, but about 10 months where I was really sitting and typing away myself.
Wow, that's actually pretty good though. That's great. It's a lot of dedication. Okay, let's see. I have 2 other people with raised hands, and let me see. Sorry about that. Let me just see who else has a question. It looks like, oh, Heather. Another one from Heather?
No, I just don't know how to put my hand down.
Oh, okay. That's all right. I don't need, Nika. Okay, Nika, go for it.
Yes, hello. I think I'm off mute now. Congratulations, Rebecca, on the launch of this book. I'm curious, what did you find was the biggest surprise to you through the whole process of writing the book? Was there anything that surprised you that you didn't expect to have a reaction to or a feeling to? What was What was that like for you?
I think especially for me, for really my debut book, it was just how much fun it was to go and take it into this team effort. And it was, I love writing. I love writing and crafting words, but then to see it become so much more through having some other input, I was surprised at just how fun that was and how much I enjoyed seeing that.
Anybody else have questions? Let's see. Oh, Tamara?
Hi, Rebecca. Can you hear me? Okay. Hi, sweetie. Congratulations. So proud of you. So my question for you is, do you have any desire to go to this area of the world?
Oh my goodness, I would go there in a heartbeat. I would absolutely, yeah. I mean, yes is the simple answer, and yeah, it seems incredible. I'm just struck by how different it is from anything here. I mean, just I would love to see something that still is on this planet but is so foreign. So yeah, I'll go there tomorrow. Sure, sign me up.
Anybody else have questions? Well, I have a few questions actually. I love this. I loved the pictures, and it's just so fascinating. So I have a question for you regarding the two different time periods. So how do you think, from reading all of their journal entries and then in the early 1900s, and then reading the blog entries in the 2000s and meeting part of the crew, the ability to actually contact people back at home, how much did that influence either their determination? Did it make them less determined, do you think, in 2018, because they were like, oh, I can still go home, everything's okay, or more determined because they knew everyone was counting on them?
Mm-hmm.
Or do you think in the 1900s they were like, oh my God, I want to go home so bad because I miss everything, that they were more determined? How is that loss of contact or ability to contact people? What do you think, from your opinion, did it have an impact on their journeys?
Sure. And not only communication, but I've often wondered, writing this, that certainly the time that they're dedicating to it is much different. It took them 6 months just to get to Antarctica. I mean, from England to Antarctica, it took them 6 months on a ship. Lou and Colin didn't even spend 6 months away from home for this. So the whole thing becomes condensed, and certainly they spent a lot of time training. But I do think, and I know there has been some reaction. I'm trying to think how to word this without giving away too much, because I don't want to spoil it for anyone.
Sorry.
No, it's a very good question. I think the issue of communication and what it means for polar exploration and what it means for records is not established. So I do have thoughts and feelings on that. I'd encourage you to read the book, if I can say that.
Oh, definitely in to do that. I was also wondering too, were there any women involved in the 1900s especially? And I'm assuming, and then you've mentioned, they called their wives, they called their teams, and I'm assuming there were women on there, but in the 2000s, but in the 1900s, did they have any women involved even behind the scenes that you found out about?
Yeah, and I mean, certainly I'm a woman myself. Certainly I'm a female engineer. The idea that I'm writing about the accomplishments of 4 men, while certainly record breaking, is, I wish there was a more, I wish I had been able to include more of the achievements of women. And I certainly do give Lou Red credit, because I didn't mention it in the brief readings today, but his expedition manager is a woman named Wendy Searle. And so she's back at home doing a lot of the logistics and posting his blog posts. And then Lou, the next season, so 2019, turns around and becomes an expedition manager for her own solo trip. So, it's one of those, I wish I could have written more about that, but I do get to at least mention that in the book. As for 1912, no, there are no women at all. I mean, they have wives. Well, Scott has a wife, Edmondson does not. But they really don't mention them. I mean, I think the closest that I get to mentioning a woman with the 1912 race is that at one point, Amundsen and his men are pulling so hard that, and I think this is one of the epigraphs that we finally included, that they are sweating in Antarctica. And so they just start stripping off clothes, and they strip, and they just keep taking off layers and layers because they're working and sweating so hard. And they end up, the quote is that they end up congratulating themselves that there are no women around, because they would be horrified because we're in our underwear. And so, there's really, it's all men with 1912. Molly, I think you might be on mute.
Oh, sorry about that.
Mm-hmm.
One of the reasons I asked is because I realized when you were reading about sort of the early 1900s expeditions, I thought that the perspective is clearly so unbalanced, that if they had included women, where you could tell in the in the 2000s, they definitely had, because, I feel like you kind of need both sides there. And I feel like in the 1900s, they probably could have gleaned some more wisdom from a more balanced. Okay, so we have a question from Carrie too that says, what was your research process and where did you start?
So the honest answer is Wikipedia, which I understand if there are any kids listening, Isabel, any other kids, be careful, but Wikipedia is a wonderful resource, and I'm biased because I love it and I read the most random things and they end up turning into books, and it's wonderful. But it is a good place to start. They tend to be very good summaries, and if you look at the citations, they're very good at leading you into the books that other people are reading and other people are citing. So from there, you just keep looking up bibliographies, and I read a lot, like so much. And so it's a little bit of a trick to get down a system of notes and keeping track. And I did a very poor job of this at the beginning, of what quotes went with which sources. And so I'm doing that much better for the next project. But there's a lot of reading. And then in 2018, for the 2018 race, this was after, of course, 2019, I was very fortunate, like I said, to be able to talk to the expedition manager. I talked to him for a couple of times for several hours, and he was just a wealth of information. I mean, just the logistics. This is how we do it. This is why we do it. This is what we don't do. And this is why we don't do that. So really being able to talk to someone for information from modern expeditions, and then just a lot of books.
Did you have any guesses as to what made Scott go? I know you said like no one's really clear on the reasons. Mm-hmm. Did you come up with any good guesses or comparative research from like the 2018 saying, okay, I understand their motivations, this might have been his? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he's a complicated character. There was a lot of fame, there was a lot of money to be won. It's hard to imagine these days, but really polar exploration was headlines. I mean, not just the kind of top of the digital edition page that Lou and Colin were at for 2018, but front and center, large headlines of the day for polar explorers. So there was certainly some fame. Scott fought what we might even call depression or anxiety, or certainly perhaps anger. And so it almost seems like there is a little bit of escapism, like he's maybe trying to run from himself, run from a darkness, run from someone he doesn't want to be back home. And so he goes literally to the ends of the earth to try and escape from it. But those are guesses. Those are, I mean, for a man who literally writes, he has no predilection for polar exploration. Why does he go twice? And we don't know. So there's no good answer.
Right, that's interesting. Does anybody else have questions? Any more questions out there I can pass on, or raised hands? I just have one more question. Oh, wait, 2 participants. Yay, raised hands. Let's see. Tyler? You want to go ahead and ask your question? There.
Hello, congrats, Rebecca. It's all of us DeLongs here. Olivia has a question.
Do you ever want to go to Antarctica, and is that what inspired you to write the book?
So I do want to go to Antarctica. I would love to get there. It's very, very far, and it's very, very expensive. So It's not going to happen anytime soon, but hopefully, someday I would love to go there. And yeah, that is part of what inspired me to go, that I've always wanted to go there, that I've always been interested in the place. So really, when I read this New York Times article and already knew some of the history of Antarctica, I think I had just some of the background to really be able to say, yeah, this is going to make a good story. And perhaps if I'm interested in it, then other people will be too.
Great. It looks like Lisa has a question also.
I do. I have 3 questions, so you may choose your own question to answer. Rebecca, first of all, let me just tell you, this is amazing, and I can't even believe that I'm sitting here watching you do a book launch. Are you kidding me? It's so awesome. So congratulations. What an amazingly impressive achievement. And I guess I want to know, first of all, I work in the film, television, and media department now at the university. So the pictures that you showed made me I realized that this would be a potential amazing film. And I'm wondering if you ever thought of maybe it being a movie. So that's question number 1. Can you foresee that? Question number 2 is if you have any advice for young authors, what would you tell a young writer kind of just starting out? And then question number 3 is, what do you enjoy reading for fun?
Sure.
So any one of the 3. Please don't answer 3. I don't want to take all your time, but I just want to know, one of those things.
Well, they all kind of go together, because have I ever pictured it as a movie? I've never made a movie in my life. I mean, I take handheld phone videos of my kids, but that's about it, but in my head, of course it's a story, and of course it's live, and of course I can picture it. So yeah, I can picture this being a movie very easily. Expensive if you're going to film in Antarctica, but yeah. Let's see here. I think I forget the second question. Advice for young authors, though, is just to read. To read, and certainly to write anything. Write in a journal, write for other people, don't write for other people. Keep writing, but most importantly, keep reading, because that's how I was inspired to write this book. And that was your other question. That's how it links in. What do I like to read? And that's why I wrote this book, because what I honestly like to read is middle grade nonfiction. And Brian Geffen, my editor, and I had this wonderful conversation earlier in drafting Race to the Bottom of the Earth, where we both agreed that it's, for some reason, this genre, this age group of middle grade, the pacing that's needed, or the description, or how to keep ostensibly a kid, but honestly my attention, that's what I like to read. And so that's part of what I like to write, and so if you have this young aspiring author that wants to write mysteries, do you like to read mysteries? What do you find yourself drawn to reading? Because that's probably what you're going to be like wanting to write, good at writing. So I think I managed to answer 3.
That's great. And actually, Lisa hit on 3 of my favorite questions to ask. As you probably know, and as I may have mentioned, our members of our Girl Power reading club are on here as well. And I love that you said, I heard this on the radio, or read this in the news, and it interested me enough to look up and to write a book about. And I think one of the questions they ask the most out of our authors are, why did you do this? How did you get the courage to do this? And just the idea that you thought of something, that you're a consummate reader, and you found something that interested you, and you picked up and you wrote a book about it. Congratulations. I think that's just fabulous. So
thank you so much.
And I think it's great. I just think it's a wonderful message. Okay. So Nika, I can't tell if you have another question. Do you have another question, or is that from before?
That is from before.
Oh, okay.
Thank you for checking.
Yes. And then Danica, looks like she has a question too.
Hi, Rebecca.
Hi.
I'm so excited for you and your book launch. This is amazing.
Thank you.
I just wanted to say congratulations, and we passed the Amazon man on our way. I'm sitting at basketball practice with my son right now. But we passed him, and I got a notification that your book arrived as we got to practice. So I'm very excited. I'm so excited to show him the book, and I know he's going to love it. So I'll probably reach out with some questions after we read it together.
Please.
Well, congratulations.
Thank you so much.
Okay, and it looks like we have another question from, let's see, Catherine.
First of all, congratulations on the book. I am so excited for you. So excited for you about this book. My question that I'm wondering about your process, honestly, very fast. Like when you were kind of describing your process of getting all this down and the interviews, were there any hurdles during the process that you saw yourself either see a little roadblock and get over? And how did you do that? That would be the question. And it's cool if the answer is no hurdles too. That's totally
no, there were definitely hurdles, and of course, this being the first, I made so many mistakes that you just do the first time. I think I mentioned just how I recorded what quotes, and there were a lot of things like that mistakes where I don't have to. Once you made them once, hopefully you never make them again. And there were hurdles, both big and small like that. Finding an adequate map of Antarctica that isn't distorted somehow, that was actually a big hurdle. That was, for some reason, that out of everything. One of the other things is that, and this is a small detail, but Lou Rudd's birthday is never mentioned in the book because, I'm sure you guys all know that's personally identifiable information. So that's, I'm sure with the military, living here in Dayton, close to the Wright Pat Air Force Base, of course we know, that the military says don't release that ever. And I'm sure that's the same way in England. And of course, I cannot find out what his birthday is. So I think I lost an entire day of writing, just panicking about how am I supposed to write a book about a guy. I don't know how old he is. I don't know when he was born, or how am I supposed to do this? And doesn't this seem like a very important detail? So that's actually never mentioned in the book. And it turns out, he states his age during the expedition. And that's what we have to go on. So he says a couple other, in different interviews, he gives different ages for, like he said, he gives a good example about when he was first interested in polar exploration, and he does give an age for that. So there were ways over the hurdle eventually, but there were several of those moments where I was just like, oh my goodness, what have I gotten myself into? And so I think a lot of that, again, comes from it being a first project and realizing that there are ways around it, and realizing how to be creative with those ways.
I think it's great you never gave up. So that's really impressive. So Lisa, do you have another question, or is your hand just still up from before? Either way, you're welcome to ask it. Or if anyone else has more questions, that might be it. But this was awesome. Thank you so much for being here. Is there anything else you want to add, Rebecca?
Question? Molly, did Heather have another question?
Oh, let me see. Oh, Heather, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to skip you altogether. I'm glad you noticed that.
No,
go ahead, Heather.
That's
Sorry.
okay. Just the last question. The only question I have is, so I know when they are planning what they're going to take, they have to pack pretty light and pretty, like very specifically. Was there anything that any of the men chose to bring that surprised you, or that was a little odd or different that you wouldn't have expected?
I don't know for myself if it was odd. I honestly, all right, I had not thought about this going into writing a book about Antarctica. Colin says he is very surprised that Lou did not bring toilet paper. Colin apparently did bring toilet paper. So in hindsight, I read that and I was like, oh yeah, I suppose that is surprising. I don't know that I really had thoughts about that going into it, but let's leave it at that.
That's really interesting, actually. And clearly, had he lived through the pandemic first, he would not have he would have known. Does anybody else have questions? And if I'm not seeing your hand, please just feel free to unmute and speak up. All right, that might be it. Well, again, this was awesome, Rebecca. Thank you so much. I'm so excited to read this book, honestly. And I loved the pictures. It was so nice to meet you. Thank you, everybody, for being here. If we have anything else, please speak up and let me know. But otherwise, thanks again, everybody.
And thanks again for hosting, Molly. This was wonderful.
Yeah, this was really, really fun. So thanks very much. Have a great night. It was so nice to meet you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.